Hello and welcome. My name is Steve Dent. I am a food blogger and I run the Circus Gardener's Kitchen website. It's a website with hundreds of delicious vegan and vegetarian recipes, most of which are accompanied by a polemical piece about different aspects of the food industry. Today's talk has been stitched together from a number of those posts. So if you like what you hear today, please pay a visit to my website. On the right of each recipe, there is an option to register so that you receive a notification each time I post a recipe. It's free, the site has no advertising, and there is absolutely no catch. So today's talk takes the form of a journey in 10 parts. It's a journey through our distant and recent history to explain how we've ended up here, facing a global pandemic and a climate crisis and so many other massive problems. But along the way, our journey will also be looking for clues as to how and what we can do to change things for the better, both on an individual level and on a collective basis. I hope you will find this talk enlightening, captivating, and inspiring. So if you're sitting comfortably, let's begin. Part 1, Perilous Journey. Thank you for joining the Perilous Journey. Not that you have much choice. Whether we like it or not, we're all part of this perilous journey. We may have joined the journey at different times, and each of us will one day leave. But while we're all here, travelling together in this tiny pocket of shared time, let's take the opportunity to look back and to see what it is that's brought us to this point of our journey, but also to look ahead through the murk of fake news, manipulation and greed towards immutable truth, beauty, and most importantly, towards hope as we think about where we want our journey to head next. Part 2, Enclosure. I want to tell you a story. It's the story of how we lost our connection to the land and in time to the earth herself. Once we all shared the land and the fruits that the land produced. We were hunter-gatherers back then, working together to hunt and to forage and sharing the food that we found. The concept of land ownership did not exist. Indeed, the notion that any of us should have rights of ownership over any part of this bountiful planet when we are all just temporary residents would have seemed absurd. Around 12,000 years ago, we began to try to tame the land. We started to cultivate crops and to rear animals. But even then, the land we lived on belonged to all of us. We worked the soil together and we shared the fruits of our labour. But then our eyes turned outwards from these shores. We built ships and began to explore the world around us, creating sea routes and triggering global trade. We found that something as prosaic as English wool would be exchanged for such exotic splendours as Chinese silk, Indian spices and Japanese steel. Wool opened up doors to unimagined treasures. And it was at that point that a greedy minority saw and seized an opportunity. They began to fence off areas of common land and to claim it as theirs alone. The areas that they seized became sheep farms, hunting lodges and private estates, and those that had been living on that common land were violently evicted, forced from the land they'd lived on for generations and forced to leave behind the only way of life they had ever known. In time, Parliament passed a law to legitimise this appropriation of common land. It was a parliament comprised exclusively of landed gentry, so they effectively voted to legalise the theft that their ancestors had perpetrated. Successive governments passed more of these laws, which became known as the Enclosure Acts. And as a result, the common land continued to shrink. The poor folk still trying to scrape a living there were referred to disparagingly as commoners. Other pieces of legislation followed: anti-poaching laws and laws criminalising the collection of firewood. Resources and power began to accumulate in the hands of a few at the expense of the rest, and the life of the commoners became impossible. They were forced to become beggars and itinerant labourers, selling their toil simply in order to eat. In time, the commoners migrated to the towns and cities to look for work, and as the Industrial Revolution took hold, they became factory fire, working in appalling conditions for pitiful wages, simply to buy the food they once produced themselves. This is how capitalism was born. Over time, the Enclosure Acts converted millions of acres of common land into private inherited wealth, so that today 90% of our land is owned by just 0.3% of the population. As for the rest of us, well, we've all but lost the connection we used to have with the land and lost many of the skills and natural wisdoms that we developed through that connection. Today, alienated from the land and the soil, we are also alienated from the source of the food we eat. Only 4% of us even attempt to grow any of our own food. Vast mechanised farms predominate the agricultural landscape. Most of us shop in supermarkets. We rely heavily on takeaway foods and ready meals. Many children have little idea of where their food comes from. Production of the food we eat has been outsourced to vast corporations. They process that food before it reaches us, adding chemicals and bulking agents, and even genetically altering it. Where once we had at least a modicum of self-sufficiency, now we are almost helpless in our dependence on powerful global corporations for the food we eat. This commodification of the simple act of eating is the consequence of a centuries-long process of greed, theft, and forced alienation. And it is the start of the story of how we came to be blown off course on our perilous journey. Part 3, the Gleaners. Once a year, in a bogus act of charity, that some of those who had stolen common land would allow commoners to come onto their estates to collect any vegetables or fruit that the landowner hadn't harvested. It was a practice known as gleaning, and the term gleaning has been revived in recent years by food waste campaigners, highlighting the tons of waste that occurs every year on British farms. A few years ago, I went gleaning to a fruit farm in Gloucestershire on an overcast, drizzly October day. And when we arrived there, the farmer came out to welcome us, this small band of damp and bedraggled gleaners. And he told us that he was happy that we were there to pick his fruit. Now, the farm grew just 2 varieties of apple, Gala and Royal Gala, and he held up one of his Gala apples for us to see. Now, to my untrained eye, it looked perfect, but the farmer told us that if he'd sent this apple to the supermarket he supplies, it would have been rejected. And that would be because, according to the supermarket, it would be the wrong size, or possibly the wrong shape, or the wrong colour, or maybe it had a minor blemish, or even because it had the wrong pressure. For the farmer to ask his migrant workers to pick the apples left on these trees would have meant throwing good money after bad, because those workers would still need to be paid, but the apples they collected would be worthless to the farmer because the supermarket would reject them. So it was less costly for him to leave them to rot on the trees. Anyway, we gleaners spread out and we worked through the drizzle, collecting what seemed to us to be beautiful apples, each one perfect in its imperfection. And by the end of the day, we had collected 4 tons of those apples, which we then distributed to food banks and refuges instead of leaving them to rot on the trees. And if you multiply those apples on one small fruit farm in Gloucestershire by the many farms up and down the country, you start to get a sense of the hidden scandal of food waste. Yet, despite its scale, this food waste at farm level barely registers with us as a society because our economic model assigns it no monetary value. To all intents and purposes, it's as if all that edible food being left to rot never even existed. Part 4, spoilt for choice. I want to tell you another story about apples. It's a different story, and it's a story about a different kind of food waste, one that's even less visible than those tons of apples being left to rot on their trees up and down the country. Apart from Gala and Royal Gala, Pox and Russet, most apples for sales in British supermarkets aren't British. They come from the USA, New Zealand, South Africa, varieties like Braeburn, Jazz and Granny Smith. When you're next in the supermarket, take a good look at them. See how strikingly uniform they are in size, shape and colour. Eerily identical. They are the apple equivalent of the Stepford wires. And some of them are also very shining. That's not a natural sheen, it's actually created by a fungicidal wax, which is sprayed onto the apples before transportation to help preserve their appearance and make them look a lot fresher than they actually are. Now, these apples, imported from halfway around the world, have not been chosen for their flavour, but for the very fact of this uniformity of appearance, as well, of course, for their ability to travel long distances. Now, I wonder if you can guess how many varieties of apple we grow here in the UK. I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about your answer. How many varieties of apples do we grow here in the UK? Let me put you out your misery. We actually grow 2,200 different varieties of apples in the UK. Now, if you could track them all down, that would mean you could eat an apple a day, every day, for 6 years without ever eating the same variety twice. Which leads us to a very obvious question. Where are these apples in our supermarkets? The answer is as simple as it is predictable. You won't find them there because they are the wrong shape, or the wrong size, or the wrong colour, or because they have a minor blemish. The dominance of the supermarket in our lives has given us the illusion of freedom of choice, whilst actually removing freedom of choice. Because over the last 50 years, while the supermarket has become the place we go to buy our apples as well as everything else, in that time we've lost 2/3 of our natural apple orchards. Now, it doesn't have to be this way, but if we want it to change, then we have to change. Once we knew everything about the provenance of the food we ate because we'd grown it or made it ourselves, or we knew the person who had. To be in a similar position today, we need to make our food choices mindfully. If we get into the simple habit, for example, of looking at food labels, we find it opens up all sorts of questions. Now, this particular label is for green beans flown by air from Kenya to the UK at the very time that British green beans are available. But there are lots of other examples, and we need to ask ourselves things like, do I really need asparagus in November when it's been flown 6,000 miles from Peru's Ica Valley, where the asparagus industry is creating enormous environmental damage? Do I really need sugar snap peas in February, all the way from Guatemala, one of the poorest nations on the planet, whose own population regularly suffers chronic food shortages? The answer is we don't. It's our choice whether or not we support the unsustainable and environmentally destructive practices that underpin many of our food options. Individually, we may think we're pretty insignificant, but every small decision we make, every action we take, creates a tiny ripple. And our power lies in those small daily choices, those ripples, one after another, building up to help create a wave of change. On our own, we cannot change the world, but we can change ourselves and we can influence those around us. Part 5, Pure, White and Deadly. After World War II, the processed food industry began to grow very rapidly. And not long after that, it was followed by a surge in rates of heart attacks and heart disease, which prompted a flurry of research to see if there was a possible correlation between heart disease and diet. In the 1950s, an American physiologist called Ancel Keys published research which suggested that the rise in heart disease was due to saturated fats in our diet. Keys' research, since largely discredited, suited the processed food manufacturers who realised it provided them with an opportunity. They could replace the relatively expensive fats in their products with cheaper bulking ingredients like salt and sugar. And so they did, and they rebranded these revised products as low fat. And we were led to believe that this meant they were healthy because that's what it said on the label. Now, 10 years after Ancel Keys' research was published, a British scientist called John Yudkin published a book called Pure, White and Deadly. Now, Yudkin's book revealed a link between heart disease and refined sugar, hence the title of his book. By implicating sugar as a major dietary cause of heart disease, Yudkin's research threatened this whole new, highly profitable edifice of low-fat, so-called healthy foods. He'd shown that the key ingredient food manufacturers were now using to replace fats in their products was actually far more unhealthy than the fat it was replacing. But what is most instructive in the story of John Yudkin is what happened next. The sugar refiners and the processed food manufacturers publicly denigrated Yudkin's work, calling it science fiction. Ancel Keys, whose own questionable research stood to be discredited, falsely claimed that Yudkin was in the pocket of the meat and dairy industries. Other attacks on Yudkin were more subtle. He had access to research facilities withdrawn. He was no longer invited to international scientific conferences. And by the time of his death in 1995, both John Yudkin and his research had become completely marginalised. Pure, White and Deadly had gone out of print. But the thing was, Yudkin was right. Such was the ferocity of the food industry's treatment of Yudkin that it discouraged other scientists from following up his research. So for the next 5 decades, the ingredients going into processed food continued unchanged and unchallenged, despite the evidence that they endangered our health. In those intervening years, we have seen an explosion in rates of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and cancer, thanks in no small part to the excessive sugar pumped into the processed foods that we consume. This is how the food corporations operate. They marginalise and discredit unfavourable research. They use misleading advertising. They use misleading labelling. They give money to political parties to shield their interests when those parties get into power. If the story of John Yudkin tells us anything, it tells us that we cannot trust the big food corporations to do anything other to protect their profits, whatever it takes and whatever the cost to our individual and collective health. This has all come about as a result of our state of learned helplessness, which in itself results from our lost connection to the land, to the soil, and to the source of the food we eat. Part 6, fast food. I'm old enough to remember the UK before the first McDonald's opened up here. And I think the arrival of McDonald's coincided with a pivotal shift in our attitude to food. It seemed to herald two things. Firstly, an onslaught of fast, cheap, energy-dense food. Almost overnight, eating became more a process of refueling than of enjoyment. And secondly, it heralded the growing dominance of the food market by huge, multinational, profit-hungry corporations who now heavily influence not only what we eat, but even how we eat it. The result has been that, unlike in previous generations, obesity and poverty no longer sit at opposite ends of the spectrum. More often than not, they now sit hand in hand because it's the poor in our society who have been most targeted by this surge of cheap, highly processed food. 45 years on from McDonald's arrival in the UK, a third of children leaving primary school are clinically obese or overweight. Now, I'm not claiming that McDonald's alone is responsible for this grotesque transformation. McDonald's is emblematic of the big food corporations who have helped to distance us still further from the source of the food we eat. Now, some of you may remember a TV series a few years ago called Jamie's School Dinners, in which the celebrity chef Jamie Oliver campaigned for improved school meals. He tried to introduce a healthy lunch menu at one particular school in Rotherham, but the children rebelled. And in one episode of the programme, some of the parents were filmed selling burgers, chips and fizzy drinks to the school children through the school's perimeter fence. It was a shocking thing to see that those parents were doing it because their children, brought up on a diet of processed junk food, had found Jamie Oliver's real food regime in their school literally unpalatable. The parents were simply giving their children the food they were used to eating. They were also, of course, subliminally reinforcing in those kids a deep suspicion of any food that does not come packaged in plastic, cardboard or aluminium foil. In short, if we hadn't already realised it, what that notorious incident revealed to us all too clearly was how much, in the space of just a few decades, highly processed food has become a staple in so many of our lives. It may be quick, cheap and accessible, but junk food is steadily destroying our relationship with food and with our own bodies. Part 7, slow food. Compare the welcome mat the UK put out for McDonald's with the reception McDonald's received in Italy. 30 years ago, McDonald's opened its first franchise in the city of Rome, and it chose to do so at the foot of the famous Spanish Steps. Now, Italians generally care deeply about their culture and about their food heritage, and many of them saw this development, this arrival of McDonald's, as nothing less than an outrageous incursion. So McDonald's arrival was initially greeted with mass demonstrations in the centre of Rome, and a court case followed, trying to force McDonald's to close. The lawsuit failed, and over time the demonstrations petered out. But as the dust settled, something wonderful and profound began to emerge, because it was here that the slow food movement began. Now, the name slow food was chosen deliberately. It was to be the antithesis to fast food and to everything that McDonald's represented. It was to be about real food, fresh ingredients, prepared with care, skill, and love. It was about pausing about taking time to savour and enjoy food. It was about being aware of the origin of the food we eat, about insisting on food which has been produced in a way which fully respects the environment, food which has animal welfare and human health at its heart, food produced by workers who are paid a fair wage. Fundamentally, slow food is about reconnecting with the land and the soil, shortening the distance between us and what we eat, reducing and removing the control exercised by the powerful food corporations. Now, bad food is cheap, but it's only cheap because the system is rigged. Nitrates on farms polluting our rivers, the taxpayer will subsidise the cleanup. Bad food giving us diabetes, cancer, heart disease, the NHS will pick up the tab. Intensive farming, creating greenhouse gases, deforestation and soil erosion, problems for the next generation. The only reason bad food is cheap is that its true and terrible environmental cost is not factored into its price. It's hidden from us. But think of each food purchase you make as a vote and weigh your vote carefully. Because buying food that travels from halfway around the world, that's been grown with agrochemicals, grown in a way that doesn't respect the environment, is a vote against the future. Likewise, choosing organic, cruelty-free, locally produced food is a vote to change the world. Part 7, a suitcase full of money. This slide shows the headquarters, or part of the headquarters of ExxonMobil, the third largest company in the world. 43 years ago, back in 1977, the board of Exxon took receipt of an important internal scientific report. The report advised the board members of Exxon that the company's oil extraction activities were having a greenhouse effect. Now, the Exxon board considered this internal report and decided to commission a second internal report to check the findings of the first. And when it arrived, that second report confirmed the findings of the first, and it also went on to warn that the consequences of climate change could be catastrophic, and that a significant reduction in fossil fuel consumption would be necessary to curtail future climate change. So the Exxon board considered these two reports, and it decided to adopt a two-pronged approach to the dire warnings they contained. And the first thing that the Exxon board did was to order that in future the company's oil drilling rigs should be built taller to compensate for the rising sea levels that they knew were coming. And the second thing that the Exxon board did was to set aside millions of dollars to fund climate change denying groups and to fund propaganda designed to undermine and confuse public opinion on global warming. Many years later, Exxon provided financial backing for Donald Trump's election campaign for the US presidency. And after Trump's election, he appointed Exxon's then chief executive, Rex Tillerson, as his Secretary of State. And a few months after that, Trump announced that the USA would be pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So, when you despair that the world is devoid of leaders who seem to care about the environment, just remember that these politicians are faithfully reflecting the values of their corporate paymasters, who in turn wield the financial muscle to help them into power. How do we break that link between corrupt corporations and corrupt politicians, when between them they seem to hold so much power? Well, we do it by remembering where our own power lies. We do have control over our own actions. We can decide what we do and do not spend our money on. The fact is that the fossil fuel companies, like the global processed food corporations, have lost the scientific and the moral arguments. All they have left is a suitcase full of money. If we care about stopping climate change, one of our tasks must surely be to empty that suitcase, or at least to stop it being replenished. Part 8, the world on fire. The Amazon rainforest has been described as the lungs of the planet. It absorbs around 1/20 of all global carbon emissions. Every rainforest fire not only reduces the Amazon's overall capacity to absorb carbon, it also, of course, releases carbon back into the atmosphere. So given the importance, the global importance of the Amazon rainforest in mitigating the effects of carbon emissions, why was it that back in August of last year, just 12 months ago, when fires raging in the Amazon rainforest were visible from space, that the Brazilian government took no action? To answer that question, we have to go back to January 2019, when Jair Bolsonaro took up office as president of Brazil and de facto custodian over the largest area of the Amazon rainforest. Now, Bolsonaro is a populist, neo-fascist politician whose attitude to the environment has led to him being given the nicknames Captain Chainsaw and Trump of the Tropics. Like Trump, one of the first things Bolsonaro did when he took up office was to dismantle his country's environmental protection agencies. And like Trump, Bolsonaro's campaign for president had heavy financial backing from big industries that don't like having environmental regulations and constraints placed upon their activity. Now, in Trump's case, his campaign was bankrolled by the oil, coal, and fracking industries. In Bolsonaro's, it was agribusiness and mining, both of whom have a vested interest in land currently occupied by rainforest. So when those fires were left to rage and burn through the rainforest in August 2019, what we were witnessing was payback from Bolsonaro to the big corporations that had bankrolled his election campaign. Fire is the quickest way to clear a rainforest, and illegal rainforest clearances more often than not result in the cleared land being used either for mining or for rearing cattle or for growing soybeans for cattle feed, because Brazil is the world's largest exporter of beef, and growing world demand for beef, and the beef burger is the single biggest driver behind illegal Amazon rainforest clearance. Even if we didn't factor in this rainforest destruction, the meat industry is already the world's single biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. If we're serious about changing direction in our perilous journey, and if we are serious about wanting to stop filling up those suitcases with money, one of the steps we are going to have to take is to change our diet, because our enthusiastic support for the meat industry is directly linked to the climate emergency as well as to the COVID-19 pandemic we currently face. Part 9, an ending and a beginning. Most of you, if not all of you, will, like me, have spent much of April, May and June in lockdown or in self-isolation. And I'm sure you're probably still taking precautions to protect yourself from the infection. During the initial phase of lockdown, you may, like me, have become more aware of some of the non-human life around us, in particular the sound of birdsong, no longer competing with the background of traffic. You might also have seen images online of kangaroos beginning to venture into deserted urban areas once lockdowns had been imposed in Adelaide, Australia. We had goats and deers in parts of the UK, wild boar in Italy, rare tigers in northern India. And what all of these things did was to give us a glimpse of how the planet might look if we humans disappeared. And the answer is it would do just fine. It would simply establish a new equilibrium. Awful as it has been and still is, the pandemic has also afforded us an opportunity, a chance to step back and see what it tells us about ourselves, about the way we live, and about our relationship with the rest of the world. COVID-19 is a coronavirus, one of many. It's a zoonotic disease, which means it's one that's passed from animals to humans. And a wet market in Wuhan, China, was the site where it all began. That was the trigger, the spillover event. But to leave the explanation there would be far too simplistic. What led to that particular spillover event happening in the first place? What are the real underlying causes and agents of this pandemic? Well, there are several. One of them is the human population explosion. It took until 1804, many millennia, for the total population of the human race on planet Earth to reach 1 billion. 123 years later, in 1927, it reached 2 billion. Just 33 years after that, it reached 3 billion. 14 years later, 4 billion. 13 years later, 5 billion. 6 billion after another 12. And now we stand at 7.3 billion, with our numbers continuing to rise exponentially. Quite literally, these are plague proportions. Another factor, as both cause and agent of the pandemic, is our diet. A significant proportion of deaths from COVID-19 in the UK have been of patients with so-called underlying health conditions. And many of these, type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart and vascular disease, some cancers, are diet-related. And the finger of blame for that must be pointed not just at ourselves, but also at the processed food manufacturers and retailers and their multi-million pound advertising campaigns. Processed foods have only featured in our diets heavily for the last 2 generations, and yet our bodies are essentially the same as those of our Paleolithic ancestors. We haven't developed physiologically to adapt to such a sudden dietary change. It's no wonder we are becoming ill. And of course, there's been an exponential rise in meat eating over the last few decades as countries like China increasingly adopt a Western style diet. And this expanding human population needs more land to expand into for rearing its cattle. Now, rearing animals for slaughter is an incredibly inefficient use of land, but growing demand for meat fuels this expansion, more and more of it. And this pressure has led to rainforest and other environmental destruction as industrial scale land clearances take place for more cattle ranches and soybean farms. And the huge number of cattle we now keep in our fields has led to overgrazing. And overgrazing has in turn led to desertification, loss of topsoil. We are losing topsoil at such a rate that the United Nations has predicted that on current trends, we will have just 60 more years of topsoil left. The pressure for more and more grazing land for beef cattle has led humans to encroach into areas we haven't been before, increasing our interface with wild animals and therefore increasing the chances of zoonotic interaction and therefore further coronavirus outbreaks. In China itself, land grabs by big industrial scale complexes, farming complexes, have pushed the traditional smallholder farmers quite literally and figuratively to the margins. This has not only precipitated encroachment into traditionally wild areas, it has also nurtured the growth in the trade of so-called exotic meats and wet markets. Another agent, certainly an agent rather than a cause of the pandemic, is pollution. There is research emerging which suggests that the impact of COVID-19 is highest in heavily polluted areas, and indeed that the virus is able to attach itself to pollution particles, helping it to spread more widely. And another agent of the pandemic is air travel. Certainly not a cause of the virus, but a highly efficient means of spreading it very quickly around the world. Now, all of these factors I've mentioned, pollution, rainforest destruction, soil erosion, air travel, all appear on another urgent agenda, the climate emergency agenda. In other words, if we were to prioritise decisive action to address the climate emergency, we would simultaneously be reducing the future coronavirus threat. Because our health is inextricably linked to the health of the environment around us. The huge amount of money thrown at constraining the COVID-19 pandemic and searching for a vaccine, coupled with the costs of shutting down most of the global economy, would have been completely unthinkable just 6 months ago. But now we know the money could be found. It could have been found to deal with the climate emergency. It was never about the money. It was the political will that was and is still missing. Part 10, ripples. There's a lot that needs to change, and it will, of course, need a lot of political will to achieve it. Sadly, that political will is in short supply as governments around the world begin to ease lockdown and put out calls for business as usual. But who does that business as usual benefit? The people who put us here in the first place, the polluters, the agribusinesses, the agrochemical corporations, the petrochemical corporations, the processed food manufacturers, organisations whose entire business ethic has depended on exploitation of people and planet. If we don't want business as usual, we can't afford to wait for someone else to come along to do what needs to be done. We have to make changes right now to our own lives that cumulatively will start to shift us all towards the wider changes that are needed. If we want to stop contributing to rainforest destruction and to reduce the risk of further coronavirus pandemics, then we need to reduce or stop eating meat. If that's too big a leap, start off with just a few meat-free days a week, or even just do meat-free Monday. Every reduction in meat consumption will make a difference. To stop contributing to pollution, reduce your car journeys, use public transport or try walking or cycling. It's good for your health too. Try and eliminate unnecessary air travel. Switch to a renewable energy provider. Reduce your use of plastics. In terms of diet, as well as cutting out meat consumption, eliminate processed foods from your diet. They are making you ill. Buy local and buy organic. This both reduces air miles and it reduces the chemicals, additives and bulking agents you're putting into your own body. Better still, grow some of your own food, whether it's in your allotment, your garden, on your balcony or on your windowsill. As someone once said, growing your own food is a political act, plus you get strawberries. Individually, we can't change the world, but we can change ourselves. And we have to do that if we want this journey to continue for our children and their children. We can create those tiny ripples. We can change others by changing ourselves, by setting an example of a better way to live. So each of us needs to ask ourselves this question: what am I going to do? What ripples am I going to create? Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Steve, and hello everyone at home. It's William here again. What a fantastic talk, Steve. That was, just fantastic. And we took away so much information. I've got copious notes written down here. I'm afraid we have run out of time for questions on this event. But are you okay, Steve, for people, like you said at the beginning, to get in touch with you if they have any
Absolutely.
questions?
There's my email address at the bottom here on this final slide. Happy to contact me that way.
Brilliant.
I'm very grateful to everyone who's tuned in, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Steve.
William, for all your help.
No problems. Okay, so our next event will be kicking off at 3 o'clock. That's with Kelda, who's going to be talking to us at 3 o'clock, like I said. And just a quick reminder to everyone again, if you are able to make a donation at our Just Giving page, justgiving.com/crowdfunding/HGF. But for now, thanks again to Steve, and see you at 3 o'clock.